Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. You're about to listen to part 3 of the Critical Thinking is Required Literature Series 1. So this is Literature Series 1. We're talking about one specific book, which is For a New Liberty, written by Murray Rothbard in 1973, which is important to point out. And this is part 3. So there's part 1 and part 2. There'll probably be part 4 and a part 5. So there'll probably be 5 parts. And today we'll be talking about chapters 4 to 8. So if you want to listen to the other ones, make sure you check out criticalthinkingisrequired.com and just click on podcast or highlight podcasts and just go down right till you see YouTube channel, and then you can either watch the video there through the criticalthinkingisrequired.com website, or you can actually go to the YouTube page and you can watch it there. Again, you can also listen to the podcast. I think that's a useful way to use it. It just depends on how you view these things. Me personally, I'm a podcast listener because I don't want to sit and watch. Like, to me, that's boring. I like to listen to stuff while I do other things, maybe when I mow the lawn or when I go running, and that's when I listen to it. And so we have this stuff. If you're listening to this on the Facebook page or Buzzsprout or whatever, we also have it on Stitcher. We have it on iTunes, and you can listen to it through that. But my goal is to finish this book and cover one more really short book, probably about anarchism or progressivism by September 1st. So that's something to look forward to. So today we're going to talk about chapters 4 through 8. And all I do is basically I'm reading the book live in real time, and I'm just covering a basic overview of these chapters to the point where I don't think you necessarily need to read it. You can always check. Oh, the other thing too is if you want to look through the PowerPoint presentation without watching the video, you can also check the show notes on the website, thecriticalthinkingisrequired.com, and you can look at the show notes. Just download it and just glance through them real fast, and you can kind of get an idea of what the book's about without having to read it. It's just a much easier way, personally. All right, so we're going to talk about chapter 4, and it's titled The Problems. So basically we have what he's writing is that we have these problems, and so this is what we have in society, or that we turn the TV on, we look at the newspapers, and these are the problems that we face. So this was written in 1973, just to remind everyone, and these are the current problems of that time. So we have high taxes, the urban fiscal crisis, which is basically, let's say, pension spending budgets that are too high in cities, municipalities, Vietnam and other foreign interventions, crime, traffic congestions, transportation, the military-industrial complex, pollution, water shortages, power shortages, telephone service, postal service, television, welfare system, urban housing, urban strikes, education, inflation. So what have we learned? Well, there's nothing new. Maybe we don't have as much problems with telephone service because we have a little bit more competition now with cell phone. But at the same time, though, you can make an argument there. But the bottom line is most of these things are still problems to this day, which I find interesting because nothing's changed in government either. It's still supportive of big government. Of course, spending has increased exponentially since 1973 and continues to spend regardless of what they say on TV. And we still face these problems. So if government's the solution, they're not doing a very good job. So chapter 5, so that's basically the chapter. It's not really worth reading, just to understand the historical repetitive nature of history and how it's happening today. Chapter 5, this is one of the bigger ones, and it's involuntary servitude. And so what is involuntary servitude? How does he define it? Well, the easiest thing is it's forced labor. It's being coerced to work, and it's not voluntary. That's what this is, forced labor. And so he looks at slavery. Well, what is slavery? Well, it's forcing people to work at tasks the slave master wishes, and you pay them either pure subsistence or less than the slave would have accepted voluntarily. So you're talking, they're doing tasks that someone in a high, the slave master wishes, so someone who controls them, and they're paying them extremely low or no wages that they would have accepted voluntarily. So here, you could make an argument, I suppose, that slavery is working minimum wage, or let's say we didn't even have minimum wage, that could be slavery if you were working $2 an hour. Maybe you were a kid or something working $2 an hour. Well, the difference there, I think, is the key words, which are forcing and voluntarily. So that arrangement would still be voluntary, and there would be nobody forcing people to do anything, because you could always move. And that's an interesting one, because if you question that, we're going to talk about a little bit, I think, when we talk about standing army. And I think it might awaken, like, to me personally, it kind of got me thinking a little bit about how you can make a better argument with that. So the question is then, are we free of slavery? So, and that's what he asked, and that's what we're going to answer. We're going to look at numerous things that are going to kind of prove that, you know what, we can come up with these examples of where there is forced labor, and thus there's involuntary servitude, which is one of the most heinous acts of crime. I was just listening to a interview with Joe Rogan and Stephen Molyneux, and Joe Rogan was personally saying, you know, this slavery thing is like the number one issue of all time. It's the horriblest, horrendous act that needed to be stopped. And the unfortunate thing is that it has not stopped. It continues, but we don't really look at it from that perspective because we don't think critically. So it's just really interesting. You're going to see some things that maybe you never thought of. And so for one of them, it's conscription. Now, conscription is something that we don't necessarily have today, but it's something that, well, we sort of have, but not really. So at the time, 1973, they were going Vietnam War, and so they had the draft. So that was something that, it wasn't voluntary. You were told to do it. So today, and he doesn't even mention this, and maybe it's because that's not how it was back then because they had the draft. But once you turn 18 and you're a male, not a female, if you're a male, you have to sign up for the selective service, right? So, officially, if there was another draft, you would then be drafted into the standing army. So I just think that's interesting. Isn't that involuntary servitude? Now the question is, so if we don't have conscription, but who will defend us against foreign attacks? And that's the question, who will defend us? And so we'll talk about that next. And I think the simple thing is we can look at the sense that, well, there would be a voluntary army. I mean, that's kind of what we have today. We have I'm using air quotes, a voluntary army, right? So we can prove that a draft isn't necessary. So we don't have to have the involuntary servitude. And it's interesting, too, because nobody really questions that today. So it's something that people questioned 30, 40 years ago, but today it's like, well, of course, yeah, why don't we just have voluntary stuff? But then you have these consequences of that, like people not caring because it's not me, it doesn't affect me, right? It's the same thing we have with all these political issues. Until it affects me, I don't care. So isn't conscription and this involuntary servitude, isn't this coercion? And doesn't that coercion, basically, isn't it kidnapping? So if you're telling someone that they have to do something and they're not doing it voluntarily and you're compelling them to do it with a punishment of fine or imprisonment or maybe even death, well, that's kidnapping, right? And thus involuntary servitude as well. So those are two separate claims. You'd have forced labor and then kidnapping. And why couldn't we hire defenders? Why couldn't we have private army? Or why couldn't we have a public army that you just hire people? And that's kind of what we have today, right? We have that voluntary army. But do we have a voluntary army? So that's a question he asked next. So he asked this question of, what other occupation has severe penalties like prison or execution? So currently, even if it was voluntary, you make this contract and you join the military, the Marines or Army or something, let's say. Well, if you desert and you run off, let's say like the Bergenhold guy or whatever his name is, you can be punished. So you're not necessarily free. You can't just leave. And in fact, it's not just that. You can either face prison and sometimes even execution. So some people even call that, in his case, they say, let's kill him because he deserted and says he's like a traitor to this nation, right? So it's not really voluntary then, right? That's forced labor. That's forcing you to be there when you don't want to be there. And so now you go, well, it's a contract, right? So you're kind of agreeing to your body being owned by someone else. So, and this is something I never thought about, especially when I thought about involuntary servitude. What's it called? What they used to do prior to slavery, and indentured servants like that. This is an important point, and we're about to cover it. So there's something called terms of service. So in a private contract where an individual has agreed to serve 2 years, he may still quit. Okay, so the terms of service when you join an army is, well, you're going to do 4 years, you're going to follow these rules, and if you don't, you go to prison or something like that, right? That's the punishment. That's what happens. Now, that's theoretically, that's assuming you don't get caught, that's assuming all these other things, right? But that's the law. But in a private contract, if I say, okay, I'm going to serve you for 2 years and I'm not going to compete, I'm not going to do other stuff, well, I can still quit. Okay, I still have that option. I mean, what's the consequence? I'm not going to go to prison. I'm not going to get executed. Well, it's just going to basically be a breach of moral obligation. I might be fired. I might have to pay back, I might have to pay back any type of monies that I've received from my employer. I might get blacklisted. Other employers might not want to employ me. I might get ostracized. People might look at me and go, oh, I don't want to deal with this guy. But I'm not enslaved. I'm not forced into labor. I still own my personal body. I have that self-ownership, that natural right to man, right? And so I can determine whether I want to stop or not. But you cannot do that even in the voluntary army today. And so then he looks at, well, what about police? So think about police, even in your local police departments. They don't have terms of service, yet they survive. Maybe they're not the best agencies out there. Maybe they're not the most efficient or effective, but they function even without these things called terms of service. So what he's kind of calling for is, well, one, we don't really have a voluntary army, but two, let's say we even had this army. Why have these terms of service? Let's let these people be able to stop, because it works with police. I mean, couldn't police just suddenly start to, quit if crime spiked in a city? I mean, if Chicago, Chirac, if they started seeing this stuff happen, couldn't they just say, I quit? Well, they're not really having a problem. There's still going to be people who will take those positions, right? So the standing army, right? So we talk about this thing called the standing army, and then a government that has a permanent standing army at its disposal will always be tempted to use it. So he looks at the founding fathers and he says, these guys, some of them feared a standing army. And one of the reasons why they didn't want to have, and a standing army is basically a permanent army. It's just someone you have there, just like we have today. Whether it's stationed overseas or even if it's stationed here, it's still permanent. It's not something that's created and maintained simply when we go to war, when we actually declare war on someone else. So, and this is one of the consequences of having a standing army that we've basically had since the beginning, is that if we have something, we're going to use it. And this is the same thing we were talking about in police militarization, that episode, a recent episode, where if we have these SWAT teams, if we have these big old anti-mine tanks, or vehicles, if we have these semi-automatic rifles and assault weapons, we're going to use them. I mean, why not? I mean, that makes sense, right? If you had a computer that was the size of a room and it was like a supercomputer, would you not use it? If you had a car that was a Lamborghini or something, yeah, maybe at first you'd be kind of nervous about it, but you're eventually going to use it, right? You want to show it off. It's free. You got it. Or maybe even if you paid for it, you bought it, you earned, you're going to use it. And so what this does is, having a standing army, it's a perpetual temptation for the state to enlarge its power. So it's going to continually use it. And when it uses it, it's going to have to increase its power in order to use it. So then we have this thing that's being created that basically expands the size of government. And we can see it today with the budget of the Defense Department and how it continuously increases and how it's being used for things that most people would not agree with. So that's involuntary servitude as well. So then we have the tax system. So is this slavery? Is this involuntary servitude? And Murray Rothbard would say yes. So we have something like the income tax, right? And basically what that is that it's a disincentive to work. It taxes you for working. So you basically have to work for a period of time for nothing, because that money is automatically going to the government. And so you have that problem. So, I mean, you're being forced into labor. That's not a choice. That's not voluntary. I mean, if it was voluntary, nobody would pay it. Well, of course, we have the William Buffetts, right, who says he would, right? Maybe, maybe not. Then we have the businesses. The business itself must spend time, labor, and money in administrating the employees' taxes. So they have to send the forms, and they got to do all that stuff and keep track of everything, the Social Security, make sure it gets forwarded. So that costs them money and time. That could be used to expand the business, or it could be used to hire more people. And then the individual, too, must do that stuff. So when you file taxes every year before April 15th, you have to go through all this drama. And so that's forced labor as well. So you have to spend days or nights, countless nights, trying to understand this system, and which is hard for everyone. So they had this thing called the withholding system. So if you notice, if you ever get your check and you have this thing called FICA, I remember the Friends episode where Rachel was like, well, what's FICA? And basically what they've done is that the government automatically takes your money out so that you don't have to send it. And this was instituted during World War II. And it was supposed to be a way, it was a wartime expedient. Basically, it was to make it easier so that the government could have more revenue to use for the war. And it was supposed to just be used during the war and then stopped afterwards. But of course, we know how government works, and it is going to continue there, right? It is going to continue. It's not going to stop, right? It's going to be permanent. That's just generally how this stuff works. And so that's an interesting aspect of this. Then what happens with, we also have the sales tax, right? And so the retailer has to collect and forward the sales tax they receive. So they have to keep track of this stuff. They have to keep their receipts. They have to be in fear of audit, and then they also have to forward this stuff. So that too isn't voluntary servitude. It's forced labor. Now what happens is that this also acts as corporate welfare because the large business can afford it. It's easy for them because they have profits. They have the money that they can basically use. And it doesn't have to be the best workers to do this stuff, right? But the smaller business has a problem. If you only have 3 or 4 employees or 20 compared to someone who has 500, you can understand how it'd be a little bit more difficult because, well, if you have 3 employees, well, shoot, now you have, you only had 3 employees to do all this work, and now one of them has to spend time, working on the income tax for the people and then the sales tax. And that's extra work, and that's just a way to make it harder for smaller businesses to compete with larger ones. So it's a corporate welfare for that ruling class and for those people who control the government, which is larger businesses, right? And again, this was written in 1973. So then the other thing, he looks at the courts. And so this is stuff I never really thought about. The power to subpoena. So if you go to a trial or something like that, and let's say there's a witness, well, they get subpoenaed. And what that does is you're basically forced to go to trial, and you're compelled to give testimony, and you are required to go there and to say stuff. Now you don't have to, you don't have to say testimony that's not going to be in your favor, but you do have to say what happened in that given scenario or wherever you're there, right? But let's say you couldn't say things that would be well, you could, but you don't have to say things that could be detrimental to you. And so isn't that forced labor? Is that not involuntary servitude because you're being coerced to do something that's not voluntary? And then the other thing, and this was an interesting idea that he had, was that the accused is required to attend the trial. Okay? And the interesting thing about that is that why do you have to do that? That in itself is involuntary servitude. They're being forced to be there. Why do they need to be? And I'm like, okay, where are you going with this, Mr. Rothbard? Well, if you're not guilty, okay, if you're innocent, you're going to go to trial. You're going to want to be there. So why does the state even have to force you to go? If you're guilty, then maybe, yeah, you don't want to go there. But, the trial is going to happen on this date. You're notified. And if you're not there, you're probably going to lose. If you don't have anyone to support you and advocate for you, you're probably going to lose if the jury or judge or whatever hears only from one side. That acts as a incentive to basically have you be there. And then another one, if the jail, the idea that while you're awaiting trial, so before you're even convicted of anything, you just have some charges against you, you're jailed. Like, what is that? Why should people be jailed? And I've seen this where numerous, especially if you're poor, so this is another problem here between the poor and the rich, and we'll talk about bail, but I've seen clients, at the public defender's office when I was there, interning there would be people there for months in jail. And they're not convicted yet, and they're serving time in jail. So they're losing their job most likely. They're probably losing their family. They're not seeing their children. You have all these problems. Yeah, they're criminals, blah, 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 but they're not convicted yet. You don't know. I mean, think of someone who was innocent and found not guilty. Someone big. I don't know. Maybe you support Zimmerman, let's say. Well, if he had served, 6 months in jail pending the whole time that they were doing all the motions and stuff before the actual trial, is that right? if he was, let's assume that he indeed was not guilty, okay, regardless of what you believe, how is that just? Like, how is that justice? How is that right? That's involuntary servitude. That's forced labor. You're being coerced to be somewhere that you would not be voluntarily. Then the other thing is bail. So this bail is this thing that basically is a judge who determines bail, and it's completely arbitrary, and they have this obscene amount of power and ability to set the bail at whatever they want. And for felonies, it's generally like $5,000. And so, I mean, what does that do for someone who's poor? Now, if you're rich, you can afford $5,000. But for someone who's poor, guess what? You're in jail. Like, there's nothing around that. Yeah, it's great, and Rothbard writes about this. It's great that there's these, the private market has created things called bail bondsmen, right? And they pay it, and you just pay a percentage. But that's still, even the $5,000, you'd have to pay what? If it's 10%, you pay $500, and you don't get that money back, whereas the rich person does. And so now you have to pay $500. Well, are you going to find $500? And so that's a discrimination. That again is part of the system and part of the problems. And so the courts, so something else, and that's involuntary servitude, because now you're in jail and you're not allowed to get out without bail. Then we also have jury service. Well, jury service is compulsory. It's involuntary servitude. It's forced labor. It compels the individual to perform tasks on the state's behalf. So that's one problem of it, right? It's not what you're doing. It's not for the benefit of you. It's the benefit of the state, because the state wants to put someone in jail. Right? Now, you could say it's the benefit of society, but we've already talked about that. Who in the heck is society? And who in the heck, whether this stuff is actually sufficient too, the punishment and all, we're going to talk about that stuff too. And then the other things that happen, well, when you're on jury duty, you get paid crap of the amount of money. So that goes back to that definition that we were talking about. It's not voluntary, it's coerced, and you're basically making nothing. And you could have been making something, or you could have been doing something else voluntarily instead. And so you're also locked behind the doors sometimes. You're prohibited from reading newspapers. You're prohibited from researching. And that's one of the wonderful things about jury. The judge will instruct you during jury instructions and say, you will basically not look on your phone. You won't look up anything regarding this case. You won't look up anything even regarding the law. You heard about this thing called jury nullification when you were walking in here? Well, no, you're not Googling that stuff. No, sir. You can ask me about it, but I'm just going to say it doesn't matter. It doesn't apply. But you're not, no. So how is that? What is that? That's slavery. That's involuntary servitude, right? You're being coerced to do something that you should be able to do. And if this was a vital service, if we did absolutely need jury service in order to benefit society, why couldn't people voluntarily do it? I mean, look at public defenders. Look at the state attorneys, the judges. These people who are in tremendous amount of responsibility and power, they're not conscripted. They're not forced to do something they don't want to voluntarily do. And things somehow seem to work, maybe not the most efficient way. So why couldn't you have a jury who would be interested in this stuff, who would know the law, who would know it very well, who would probably see case after case and kind of understand and be able to see the differences? Why couldn't they do it? So it's something to think about. So what would the libertarian court look like? And so this is, Murray Rothbard kind of looking outside the box. And he's saying, okay, you got all these complaints, you're a cynic, you're all Mr. Negative. So what do you want to do? Well, besides some of the stuff that we've already talked about, like the jury duty and having it voluntary, you could not even have a court. You could have no state attorney. So let's say we still have a court, right? Maybe we have no state attorney. And what would happen instead is you'd have the victim, so the person who's actually hurt, who would try the case. So, not necessarily that person individually, but they would hire somebody, or there'd be some business that would then serve to try the case. Well, there's no society to protect, right? This idea that we're going to protect society and that's why we need an attorney that works from the government to do that, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because again, there is no society. I can't look outside and see society. And what the hell is it? And who defines it? The 51%? The 30% that voted? Like, that's not society. What about all the other individuals? What about the minority? Are they not society? We've discussed this before. And the victim, it would make the sense, would have the most incentive to try real hard and to seek justice in what they think it's going to be, right? And that goes back to the punishment. So the libertarian court the punishment would be provided to the victim. He or she would determine what the punishment is. Now, of course, there'd be certain, it's not like you could, I don't know. I don't know how that would work if you could, could you shoot them? I don't think you could. That would violate the non-aggression principle, right? So, you'd have to have that equal thing. Maybe if they shot your kid, that maybe you could make an argument that you could then shoot them because it's proportional. I don't know. He didn't really talk about that. He focused on this idea that a lot of libertarians look at, which is restitution, because that would make the most sense anyways. I mean, is it really going to help you that if your child is killed, that you're going to want to kill that person who did it? Maybe not. Or maybe you just want to receive compensation for losing your child. I mean, you've put all this time and effort into raising the child. You no longer have a child. You want to be compensated. Or for numerous other crimes. I mean, especially, it's a lot easier when you're not dealing with murder. You're dealing with something like theft. And then the final thing is, police should be held to the same standard as the accused. And we've kind of talked with this with the excessive force episode and some of those other episodes, where there shouldn't be an exception that certain rules only apply to police and then other rules don't, right? All the rules should apply similarly to police and to the victim and to the defendant. There shouldn't be any special rules for anybody. So then another thing he was looking at was compulsory commitment. And so that's basically, putting people in mental institutions. And this idea is that, well, if the patient or the person who's causing, there's a possibility that they could be a danger to society. So we need to commit them. We need to put them here, right? But the commitment generally isn't based on some overt act. They haven't necessarily done anything to harm anyone, but it's based on someone's arbitrary judgment that act, that overt act, that danger to society could happen someday. So we were even looking at this with the shooting in Santa Barbara that happened a few months ago. Well, you hear these calls for, well, should the police intervene earlier? Maybe put these guys behind bars earlier because they show some signs of being crazy. Well, what the hell is being crazy? How the hell do you define that? That completely arbitrary notion that that's involuntary servitude. You're forcing them to go somewhere and they haven't even done anything. They might be crazy, whatever that is. But until they violate that non-aggression principle, they shouldn't be locked up. That makes no sense. And if it did somehow make sense, well, why in the world would you not just lock up all the ex-convicts? So everyone who's already committed a crime, they've already proven that they can't comply with the law. So why do they need to be free? So even if they, serve their time, well, they've proven that they can't follow the law. So let's just put them away. I mean, why not just do that? Doesn't that make sense? Oh, crime would go down then, right? So now we're going to talk about chapter 6, and this is personal liberty. Oh, I had to get a drink. See, I've learned something with doing these shows is you have a drink that has a straw. That makes things a lot easier. So now we're going to look at this is a really good episode because this chapter in itself is going to be talking about numerous issues, all from a libertarian perspective. So these really give you the principles of the arguments. Of course, you could spend an episode or a whole discussion on each topic, but we're just going to give a kind of a roadmap and just sort of simple views over it, just like he did in the book. So freedom of speech. Now, we've already talked about this. It's just a property right? That's the easiest way to define this. But he's looking at this freedom of speech, and he's looking at the problems, sort of, and the solutions. So incitement to riot. Okay, so that's something that's currently illegal. If you, maybe in the Ferguson thing, if that's happening lately, if you were to go outside and say, let's bum rush the police officers, let's attack them right now, that'd be illegal. You could go to jail. That's an incitement to riot. But what he argues is that that's advocacy. That's simply advocacy, because if A tells B and C, you and him go ahead and riot, you have two issues, sort of, which is one, does A have any control over B and C? No, he's just simply advocating an idea, and B and C are actually, they have the free will to commit the act. So they can determine whether they're going to act or not, and then show A shouldn't be liable. It's just simply advocacy. And so libel and slander, well, that's often defined as the falsely or maliciously damaging the reputation of another. So it deals with reputation. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, does someone have a right to his own reputation? And think about it. I mean, is reputation a scarce item? Is it a scarce resource? Is it something you can hold? Is it something tangible? Is it something that you can possess? Well, no. It's basically the function of the subjective feelings of others. It's these feelings. It's what I think. I mean, how can you control what I think? Should the government compel me and coerce me and threaten me with fine and punishment in jail for thinking some way about someone else? No. Now, it might be immoral. It might be immoral for me to say, to tell my friend that, hey, I saw my boss the other day and he was doing this and that, even when he wasn't, in order to damage his reputation. But it's not illegal. You shouldn't be able to go into jail. And this is another example of that rich and poor discrimination, where the rich people, as often as can be, they can use this court system, which is expensive, it's supremely expensive, and they can use it as a club against the poor. So they can threaten the poor and say, oh, we're going to sue you with this if you do if you go through with this, right? It's like it can be used as a threat, kind of extortion. So then we can also look at picketing and demonstrations. Should we be allowed to picket and have some sort of demonstration, a march, right? Should the situation in Ferguson again, should they be able to walk on the road and demonstrate that, hands up and all that stuff? Should they be able to do that? Well, it is illegitimate if it's used to block access to a private building, right? So, because then at that point you're dealing with, you're actually violating the non-aggression principle by having that initiation of force against somebody else, right? You've initiated it because they can't get into your private building because they're on your private property. We're assuming they're on your private property, right? But what about the public streets? That's where we kind of get into iffy territory. But let's remember that it's government that has created this problem because they've created the public streets. Now, we can talk about the private market having their own roads, and we will. But the government, by not being a private owner, they lack any criterion. So they can't say, because there's no profit incentive. So there's no way for them to judge whether they should allow someone to come in or not. So what they have to do is they have to make these rules that are arbitrary. And you can look at that when you look at the laws and all the news articles regarding abortion clinics and how they set up these things, or even in Ferguson or in the Bundy situation where they had these little, First Amendment territories, like that's so arbitrary where they go, where they can be, it could be miles far from where the event's happening. And so that's all arbitrary. But if they were private streets, well, it would be the owners who would decide whether to rent out that street for demonstrations. So they'd say, is it valuable to me to have picketers there? Well, maybe if they prove that they're not going to be violent, then yeah, maybe, because I'm going to get paid, I'm going to get something. But if it causes people to not want to drive on my road, well, then it's not in my incentive, it's not in my self-interest, so I'm not going to let them do it. And yeah, you could go, well, then what would happen to picketing? There would never be this stuff. Well, no, because you could do it on private property. You could still be able to pay and rent out. I mean, you have to do that anyways when you have to get, when you have to go through government in order to get a license or a permit. I'm sorry, I was thinking of the word. In order to conduct a demonstration, you have to pay money for that stuff. So why couldn't it be the same with the private? And at least you don't have to worry about these conflicting, government doesn't have to choose arbitrarily which people they're going to allow to speak and which not. And so again, with those issues, what you have is like the government creating problems. You can look at it with abortion clinics too. That if that was a private business, what they would probably do if you were, let's say you were a abortion clinic and you were trying to protect the people who were coming in, you would probably buy a larger territory. You'd have a larger sidewalk. And so that the people who are going there wouldn't feel threatened because they could park and walk inside, and that nobody from outside could go onto that property unless they had the permission of the owners, which they wouldn't give to people who were going to, basically assault and give death threats to the people who are going in there. So you'd solve it. And then you wouldn't have to create this us versus them mentality because it'd be the private market that would be dealing with it and not society. So that's one of the problems. So now we're going to look at broadcast media. And that's basically the radio and TV. Now he wrote more about those issues. Now we have internet, but that wasn't then around at that time. But there was something called the Radio Act So a little bit of history here. There was something called the Radio Act of 1927. And basically what that did is the FCC took control of and nationalized the airwaves. So what they've done is basically they've controlled the means, and they say you have to get a permit or a license or something to have a certain channel. Now, they've done it for numerous reasons, and we'll go over them, but the bottom line is that it's the government who has control. So one of the consequences you're going to have is that then they're going to have to arbitrarily pick who can have a station, and they're going to limit those stations, and it's probably going to be used by the ruling elite and by the people who have influence in government to, with that relationship in order to get more stations, to be in their benefit, right? So again, we have that discrimination against the poor, against the just average person who's trying to start up competition. So what Murray Rothbard says, let's privatize instead. Simple as that. But then you go, well, aren't these scarce things? I mean, let's say you're on a wavelength, because you're looking at the radio waves. There's only there are a limited amount. It's not infinite. So maybe it would make sense for the government to make sure to control that stuff. But then you'd have to think, well, isn't everything scarce? So, I mean, look at TVs. Somehow that's able to be, distributed amongst consumers. And, indeed to the biggest point where everyone can have a TV, if not two or three. And so why does government have to step in and distribute those things? They don't do that to TVs. So why do they have to do it for radio waves or for TV channels? And if they weren't scarce, then it would be free, and then everyone could just take it all, and then you wouldn't have to deal with that. But they are scarce, and they're just like TVs. So why do you have to get involved? And indeed, what would happen if they were privatized is you'd have far more stations than what you have now, and more people would actually use them. But then you'd have another worry, right? And this was one of the biggest worries at the time, especially during the 1920s and that time of the radio, when it was first in its genesis, was interference with one another. So you'd have one station that would maybe interfere with another because maybe it would go on the same wavelength, the same FM or AM channel, or maybe it would do that, or it would interfere somehow, right? Well, even if that did happen, let's assume that did happen, well, then there'd be a violation of property rights. So you'd have that non-aggression principle that's being violated. There would be basically a trespass, or it'd be a theft. I mean, he didn't really define exactly what it would be. Probably a trespass, because you're interfering with someone else's property rights, right? And even if, let's say they do interfere, right? Well, should we then nationalize all cars because they can drive on another's land? So think about it in that sense that we have all these roads. We have, you have private roads. And I mean, I'm driving my car on a public road, or even my own private road, let's say. I could still potentially interfere with their private road, right? So why doesn't government step in and just nationalize all the roads, or nationalize all the cars and be able to say only these people can have cars, just like only these people can have this radio wavelength? And you're going to continue to see that theme throughout this book. And so in the YouTube video and in the PowerPoint presentation, I show a little chart, and it just looks at the growth of internet radio and how you can just see it expand. And what I love about internet radio, and indeed this podcast and what it does, is that I don't have to get a license, and neither do these 6,000 other people, or much larger today. They don't need to get a license, and yet we still somehow work. It's magical. I mean, think about how that stuff works. I mean, the domain names too. Critical thinking is required. Of course, you could go out and go buy criticalthinkingisrequired.org or something like that, and maybe we'd have some dispute between us. But I own the .com, and so I have a property right in that. And so if there's any problems, we would go to court and blah blah blah. But my basic argument is that nobody else can really own my domain because there's only one. And so I just think it's just interesting how we can do that without government. So another topic, and we're still kind of within freedom of speech and within these various freedoms that we have and liberties, is pornography. And so what he says is that the law should not enforce anyone's conception of morality, right? So, one, you have the problem with defining what is moral. And if the government's going to just arbitrarily pick things that are moral, like it's immoral to look at this type of pornography, whether it's child or whatever it is, for various, I mean, he doesn't really write about child pornography, which is kind of interesting, especially with consent, because, I mean, that's a big issue. But with just normal, or maybe that some of the extreme stuff that's out there, right? Well, the law shouldn't be, let's say that was enforced. Well, then why couldn't the law prohibit all these other stuff? Why couldn't they prohibit violent TV, violent games, all this type of things? There'd be no reason that they couldn't do that. And indeed, forcing men to be moral deprives that person of the very possibility of being moral. So it must be freely chosen. Otherwise, there's no morality game there. There's no philosophy or free will being chosen there. If you're going to make it illegal to do something and say that, it's going to be moral to do this, that wouldn't make much sense if you don't even have the choice. So it's an interesting point. So now we talk about sex laws. And these just are various laws that deal with sexual, stuff. And so we'd have marriage laws. And what he says is, let's legalize all interrelations between consenting adults. And that gets, again, with that morality. Why should the government step in and say why, we feel it's immoral for blacks to marry whites? I mean, that's what they said at one point, right? And now, it's immoral for one man to marry another man. Well, if they're consenting, what's the problem? It's voluntary. It's not forced. What problem do you have there? Rape laws, he just basically says, shouldn't have a separate law that's called rape. It should just be an assault. It should be battery. That's easy as that. Prostitution, there's a big topic for libertarians. Well, what it is it's basically a voluntary sale of a service, right? Think about it. If let's say you do massages, or you do nails or something like that. Well, that's a service, and you're having a voluntary exchange. Let's assume that that's what's happening. Well, it's the same thing with prostitution. It's just the only difference is that the item that's up for service is your person, which, by the way, would even support it more that you'd have this ability to make that sale voluntary, because you don't even have to talk about homesteading or anything like that. Because it's you. It's that easy. And then we can look at the consequences of the brothel prohibition and this prohibition of prostitution, because there was a day, back in the day, they had these brothels and they basically competed against each other. And what was really interesting, reading the Renegade History by Thaddeus Russell lately, and how there was a time where these women, the women they basically were the owners of these brothels, and they were rich. They were millionaires of the time. They were they were hugely, they had a huge amount of value, and they could buy things that no other women at that time could buy. And you have your own problems with government trying to interfere there, trying to keep women back on that down level, right? Which is sad. And then what you have, so not only do you have that problem, and then you have street walking. So now you see the prostitutions, they're on the street and they're trying to sell their service. And then you have problems with the black market, you have pimps and all that stuff. And violence that's not being, that's not being fixed. There's no way to really help that because it's on the street. But when they had brothels, they could do that. They would make sure that they'd make sure you paid up front. They'd make sure the payment was received. They would make sure that nobody was hurt. Because that makes sense. It's a business. That's what you do in a business. It's when it's prohibited and illegal, when you have consequences that are these unintended consequences, like street walking and like these violations of assault and all that stuff, sexual assault, rape, etc. So then we have that wonderful topic of abortion. And so I just have one sentence from him because he treats this kind of short, and I think it makes a decent point, although it took me some time to kind of understand the sentence. But he writes, if the fetus has the same rights of humans, so the living thing that's inside of a person. So regardless of when that conception occurs. So let's just call it fetus, and you define that however you want, right? And let's assume that has the same rights of humans. Then what human has the right to remain unbidden as an unwanted parasite, he's using a big word, emotional word there, within some other human being's body? So we talked about it in part 1, I think, where we talked about the power of language. He uses that word parasite. And it got me thinking that, let's say, okay, you're the woman, you have a fetus that's inside of you, whether it's life or whatever it is, but you don't want it there. I mean, that's why you're getting an abortion, because you don't want it there. It's not about you wanting it and just not knowing what to do. It's you not wanting it. So what human right do you have? So let's assume that you have some right to be alive, to be protected by the state. Well, is the state going to force you to be in someone else? I mean, think about it in the sense like, is the government going to compel you to have sex with someone else, or for you to go to someone's house and you to live there? Like, they shouldn't be able to do that. Like, what right do you have? I mean, that violates their rights. So now you are in that body and you're violating it. Now, you could make an argument of consenting because you're the one that had sex, so maybe you consented to something. But then you're getting into topics of voluntary and, consent. So maybe there'd be a topic there, but I just thought that was interesting. And that's definitely a topic that we could discuss in an episode in the future. So wiretapping. Wiretapping was pretty big at the time. And today we can see it with NSA and the CIA. And basically, he asked the question, and this is a theme too of today's episode, is would we condone private wiretapping? If let's say our internet service, our ISPs, they looked at everything that we looked at, and then they used that to attack us in some fashion, and they kept track of all this stuff. Would we be okay with that? Would we be okay with every time we talk on a cell phone that the cell service recorded everything we talked about? Would we be okay with that? I mean, even you can look at Gmail, right, where that stuff is in there, but that's voluntary. Like, we know about that, right? If we don't know about it, then that's what wiretapping is. And so then you can make an argument that shouldn't be allowed. So maybe at a point with Gmail, before we actually knew about it, you can make an argument that we should not condone that and all that stuff. But that's beyond that. And so it is a criminal act to invade the property of anyone not yet convicted of a crime. So if the police can wiretap, well, it doesn't make sense for them to be able to, trespass into your house and commit that property crime, right? Because they've trespassed when you're not even convicted. You've done nothing wrong. You're just under suspicion. That makes no sense. So gambling. So one of the biggest problems with gambling is that it's unenforceable. It's one of the biggest unenforceable prohibitions that we have today, because everything can be gambled. I mean, we can look at the stock market. That's a gamble. We could look at a football game, just simply making a gamble there. Thinking maybe at your home and you're married and you make a gamble, who's going to, change the diaper next. And maybe you have a little bet, the first one to do this. So that's a gambling. That would be illegal, right? And then if it was immoral, let's say people make this argument that it's immoral, and they go, well, and this is what they make when they make these prohibitions against gambling, is that, well, the poor person, he can't control himself. He's dumb. He's stupid. And what he's going to do is he's going to waste his money. He's going to spend all his money on gambling when he should be spending that on his family, on bettering his future, blah, blah, blah. Well, then you have to ask yourself, well, why not then prohibit other stuff? So he's spending money on television. Why should he be able to do that? He's spending his money on video games. He's spending his money on videos, on beer, on clothes, on his car. Why should that be allowed? Why not prohibit that stuff? Where's the principle there? And these are some of the problems. So drugs. So one of the reasons we prohibit drugs is because it's harmful. It's going to cause damage to individuals or to society as a whole. Well, what about all the other stuff that does that? What about Facebook? Look at something today. Or look at the stuff that he looked at, which was candy or soda and drinks or alcohol. That stuff was allowed. Why should candy be allowed? Now we have the government coming in and saying, well, a big gulp, right? 128 ounce, that's just too much. But a 64 ounce is okay, or a 40 ounce is okay. Like, that doesn't make sense. And then if they can prohibit the big gulp, why don't they just prohibit everything? Twix bars. It shouldn't be 4 pieces of Twix bars, not the king size. It should just be 1. And then not only that, but you should only be able to buy 1 of them. So you have your own problems there, right? And then there's this problem of addiction. Well, the problem, what it's going to do is it's going to cause addiction, and that's going to equal more crime, because they're going to want to feed their habit. But that's the problem, is that crimes are committed by addicts, driven to theft by the high price of drugs that's caused by its prohibition. If it wasn't prohibited, people would supply more, and then the prices would go down, and then more of them would be able to feed their addictions. they'd be able to sustain themselves, and they wouldn't be forced to commit crimes, or at least not more crimes. Maybe it would be fewer crimes or no crime. I don't know. And even if so, let's enforce the crime and not outlaw the item, because that violates the non-aggression principle. Let's just, if there's theft and a violation of property right, violation of NAP, then you enforce that. It's that simple. So gun laws. Well, we talked about this briefly with Ben Stone in our interview with him, although it was kind of messed up, so you may not have heard it. But the importance of looking at the gun laws and gun control is that the principle here is that no physical object is in itself aggressive. Okay, any object, any that you can think of, can be used for aggression or any peaceful purpose. Okay, I mean, think of anything. We can think of a rock. We can think of hammers. We can think of knives. You know, all these things are used peacefully or aggressively. It's based on you, the person who's controlling it, not the object. The object doesn't do anything. I can use a knife to put butter on my piece of bread, or I can use it to stab someone in self-defense or anything else. But the knife, when it's just sitting on the table, is not aggressive. It's not doing anything. And so, you know, everything's like that, even paper. I mean, I could do a paper cut, you know. I could cause a paper cut onto somebody. So it's not the object, it's the person. Now, there could be an argument, I think, like let's say you had a nuclear bomb, that maybe that could be an aggressive, but regardless is that it can't do anything on its own. You would have to do something to initiate some sort of force, right? And then you would violate the law, right? You'd violate NAP. So why would and then the other problem is that let's say we do prohibit guns. Let's say we took all guns out. We somehow prohibited it all. Or we controlled it where you could only own one gun. Well, or in a specific type of gun, right? Or a specific, maybe you couldn't own guns but knives or whatever. Let's just say we prohibit it. Well, why would a criminal follow the law? I mean, think about it. This is easy, right? Real easy. They are a criminal. Let's remind you. They've proven that they don't care about the non-aggression principle, that they don't care about respect towards others, that they don't care about the law. So why would they follow the law? Like, I mean, seriously, I'm asking you. Seriously. Now, you could make an argument that maybe crime would go down, but we don't know. Maybe it would go up. No idea. If everything was prohibited, is what I'm saying. But the bottom line is that they're criminals, and they're going to act criminally, and they're going to get guns anyways. Maybe not as many as before, but they'll get it, and they'll use it. And we won't be able to defend ourselves. So chapter 7, this is about education. This is kind of a big chapter just about education that I kind of summed up short. So there's compulsory attendance laws, right? So these are the things that basically force children up to a certain age to attend public school. So one, we have that involuntary servitude. So this is just one additional example of involuntary servitude. You are being forced. You know, if you don't, either the parent could get in trouble or the child could get in trouble, you know, whether through fine or imprisonment. And so you are being compelled to do something that you don't voluntarily want to do. And then beyond involuntary servitude, we have the issue of, well, if you're forced to do something, are you going to have the best people there? I mean, think about it. Let's even think about it at your work, okay? Let's say you love your job, but you have to go to a meeting. You know, everyone hates meetings. And you're forced to go to a meeting, but you don't want to be there. Do you think it's going to be the best efficient use of time? That somehow 10 people are going to come together and they're going to work magic in this meeting, and they're going to come up with the newest product that will just make your business explode with profits? No. Why? Because everyone's pissed off that they have to be there. Now, if you are voluntarily there, then that's different. But if it's a mandatory meeting, you're forced to be there. Now, maybe you guys will come up with that idea, but for the most part, I think you will completely agree with me that you're not going to be happy, and so the inertia of creation is going to be lacking. And there was an interesting quote that you said here, is that something is terribly wrong with America's proudest institution, especially in urban areas. That feels like a freaking quote from today. I could read that quote from NPR. And guess what? The government's in control, just like it was in 1973, just like it was today. In fact, we're more in control now because we're spending records amount more. I mean, I think in that time, the federal government may not, I don't know, what Nixon and Reagan and all that. And Nixon was what, 60? Yeah, so probably maybe they did have the Department of Education, but maybe not, because I think it was the 50s or 60s. But regardless, they were in their genesis, the beginning of it. But now we have, the Department of Education has massive control and massive spending, and nothing's changed. It's actually gotten worse, some would argue. Right? Something is terribly wrong, especially in urban areas. Same problem, but nobody's looking at these solutions. Murray Rothbard, he wasn't listened to. We're minorities here. If you're even listening to this still, we are minorities, and we're not listened to, and we may or may not be in the future, and they're going to continue to do this stuff because that's, we've talked about this before. And then he defines education. So what is education? Well, it's the lifelong process of learning. It's not something that just occurs in a school, or in fact is what actually occurs in school. Maybe some technical stuff could be taught, but true education, and that is a lifelong process of learning. It takes place in all areas of life. At home, going to the bathroom, you can learn something. I can learn wiping back to front is something I learned about, or front to back. There's different things that you could do. I'm kidding, but although I did learn that. But the fact of the matter is you can learn everywhere, and in fact, we do learn everywhere, even if we don't think about it. That's what's happening. We don't have to be taught in some jail and prison-like area and situation where we're locked between this cage of these thick concrete walls, and we're in a classroom forced to be there. It's not voluntary, and that's not education. And so, a brief look at history of public schools. Well, he mentions this guy named Archibald Murphy, and this was in 1914, and he's basically the father of public schools in North Carolina. And he had this interesting quote as well. And this basically summarizes everything that he wrote in this section of the book regarding public schools and its history. Well, he wrote, and this is Archibald Murphy, quote, "All the children will be taught in them. Habits of subordination and obedience be formed. The state must place them in school where their minds can be enlightened and their hearts can be trained to virtue." So we're looking at that history of public schools. We're looking at that's why they wanted to have public schools. It wasn't to help the children. It was to make sure that they could be obedient to the state. And that, you can think about it. They're doing a damn well good job, because their goal is not to teach critical thinking, although that's what they want to, especially nowadays, that's what they're trying to, Common Core and all this stuff are trying to stress it. But they've been trying to stress this stuff for decades. This isn't new, this idea of critical thinking in schools. And they're just, it's a sham. But we can look at it even in 1914, 100 years ago. Actually, yeah, 100 years ago, where that was the purpose of the schools, and you can still see that today. And they're doing a damn well. We can look at the Pledge of Allegiance. We can look at the unquestioning of government authority, all this stuff, the lack of critical thinking, etc. Now, intellectuals at the time, and we talked about intellectuals in part 2, the last part, and how they're being used to basically give credibility to the state. Now, these intellectuals at the time, during the brief beginnings of the public schools, they wanted to turn children into one people, that's in quotes, and thus cripple the culture of the ways of immigrants into America. So at that time, the 1920s, 1910s, that time of the century, you had a lot of immigrants that were coming in, Germans, Polish, people everywhere, right? And people were scared, just like we are today with immigrants from Mexico and Honduras and all these places coming up. We don't want our cultures to mix. We want our culture. It's perfect, right? It's exceptional. We want one people. And so what they wanted to do is create these public institutions and compel you to go there and force you to go there. You can't go to your own Polish school or Jewish school. You have to come to ours, because we wanted to separate. We wanted to make sure you follow us and not you. We want one culture. So those are two really horrible truths to the history of public schools that often aren't looked into. So then you have the details of how the school works. Well, the very nature of the public school requires the imposition of uniformity and the stamping out of diversity and individuality in education. So each individual is unique, right? We all have these unique abilities and interests. The individual is the smallest minority. And what the public school does is that because it requires bureaucracy and rules, that it has to create a uniform set of rules in order to treat everyone equally, right? And so what that does is it's going to hurt people, it's going to hurt individuals because everyone's different. So if you are forced to teach reading a certain way and you have to do it to the whole class, well, that's going to hurt people who don't learn that way, right? So you can automatically see the problems. And so who has to decide these details and how that runs? Well, the state has to decide, whether it be the local, the state, or the federal government. You only have 3 choices. That's it. But when it's private, you'd have numerous. You'd have dozens, hundreds, thousands of different choices, right? So the state has to decide, is the school going to be traditional? Is it going to be progressive, competitive, egalitarian, liberal arts, vocational, sex education, religious, secular? What are we going to talk about? Well, it doesn't matter, because whatever we decide, people will be deprived. There's going to be minorities. There's going to be individuals, because they're unique, because they have different interests, different abilities. They will be deprived of their right to ownership and the right to learn. The right to ownership. And so what's the solution? Well, you have it private. It's that simple. Then each parent would be able to patronize its own kind of school. So in fact, what you would have, instead of having one people, in quotes, one culture, you'd have massive culture. One of the things we talk about now is this multiculturalism. That's one of the things that were pushed when I was in college recently. And, you talk about diversity, and we need blacks and whites and Hispanics and Indians and all this stuff. Well, you get that by having different types of school. You'd have different diversity, different forms of learning. You'd go beyond just race too, because race is, I guess, important, I suppose, but really it's ideas. It's individuals. Remember, we're all different. Even, I'm going to throw this crazy idea out, is that just because you're black doesn't mean you're the same as all the black people. You're going to be different because you're an individual. You're the smallest minority. You even go beyond the minority of being black. You go beyond the minority of being a black woman, being a black transgender, being you could go on and on, the individual. And so Murray Rothbard looks at, think of the magazine, okay? Let's think of magazine. Let's think of books or a magazine today, okay? So like Newsweek or National Review or what else, Slate or I don't know. Game Informer, I get Game Informer, right? Well, the government's not control. They're not in control. They don't say whether, just like with schools, they're in control, right? They decide where the school's going to go, who's going to get it, how much it's going to be. They're going to, all the details that we just talked about, right? But with the magazines, they're not. But guess what we have? We have all sorts of magazines. There are too many to even talk about. Have you ever had one of those people come to your door and say, hey, you want to buy a magazine? And you look at that list and it's like hundreds of things. That's what happens when you have the private market here offering solutions, is that each individual is going to patronize what kind of magazine they want. But if you only had one kind of magazine, just like you only have one kind of school, because that's what's going to happen because of the rule, it's everything we talked about before, is you're going to have battles and conflicts. And we've talked about this before with laws. That's generally what we kind of see. And that's a theme that I think I missed here, is that all this stuff, and indeed government control of a lot of this stuff, is it causes problems. It causes that us versus them, like with abortion. If it was a property rights issue based on your property of that building, right, then you wouldn't have to be worried about, or the property rights of that individual, you wouldn't have to be worried about whether it should be allowed or not, or whether the parent should be notified or not. You wouldn't have these conflicts. It would be that simple. But now we have to have these conflicts, and I would say it's because it's to keep us dumb. It's to keep us quiet. While we're busy fighting each other, just like within the Libertarian Party, while we're busy fighting one another, and if we're doing it aggressively instead of doing it constructively, then what's going to happen is our power to change things, our influence among others, is going to be lower, drastically lower, and it's just not going to change anything, and it's really unfortunate. So then we look at the burdens and subsidies of public education. Well, public schools force those parents who wish to send their children to private school to shoulder a double burden. So now the people who want to send their kids to private schools, okay? So they have kids, but they want to send them to private schools. Well, now they have to subsidize public school children because they have property taxes and all that stuff. They have to pay for those other kids. Plus, they have to pay the private school for them to go to school. Is that right? Is that fair? Is that, what is that? Is that involuntary servitude? Think about it. Is that slavery? Is that forced labor? Is that voluntary? Is that coercion? Is that being compelled to do something you don't want to do? And then you have the other problem where religious parents have to be forced to subsidize secular schools. I mean, if I'm Mormon or I'm an atheist, why should I be forced to subsidize these other schools? I guess maybe not atheists. And then you have unmarried and childless couples who are really, I think, the biggest burden here is because you don't have kids. So why do you have to subsidize them? And if you're giving this idea that, well, society is better for having education, I mean, damn, just look at the statistics and look at the quotes I've had with Murray Rothbard saying the problems with urban areas have the highest unemployment rates. Blacks specifically, they have unemployment rates for their kids, 18 years old, 50% and higher. And that school, what the hell is the school doing that's providing them skills to take to an employer, even if they could get a job or to create their own job or do something? It's ridiculous. I guess I'll be on this image real fast. I might have to actually use this image for a meme. So now our last chapter, I think, is chapter 8, and it's welfare in the welfare state. I've sort of skipped a lot of stuff because I feel like it was very race heavy. If you've listened to my interview with Walter Block, he seemed to make these assumptions that, and this is one of the things I didn't like about it, he made these assumptions that because blacks, I don't know what he said specifically, it just sounded outrageous when I heard it, but like blacks were bad at math because, and then he looked at history or something like that. And I don't follow that stuff. Maybe you do. And if you do follow that stuff, then take the time to read the chapter. I just don't like that stuff. I think a lot of things are environment. And I think that's where you learn things. I don't think anyone is naturally better at something than someone else. Unless, of course, it's something physical, like it's something in your genes, like physical. But even then I'd argue, like, just because I'm tall, it doesn't mean I'm going to be a good basketball player. I might statistically have a higher chance. There might be more of a probability that I'll be better. But, I mean, I've known tall people that are poor basketball players. I mean, if they're tall and fat, and if I'm fast and I can shoot really well, I can just dribble right around. And I can dribble well. I can just dribble right around him and make a layup. I'll get the guy tired and then and shoot it. I mean, like, well, how are you going to compete with that? And so I don't like that race stuff. So let's talk about the welfare and the welfare state. Well, and this is very short. So you have this thing called the positive supply function. And this is the basically gist of the problems of welfare. And this is just principles here. Just like one of the things about For a New Liberty, it's basically principles. And so when the incentives to go on welfare rises, and this is a rule, this is just a fundamental rule. When the incentives to go on welfare rises, so it's just easier to go on welfare, well, the welfare rolls will lengthen. So just think about it. If it's easier to do something, well, more people are going to do it. If it's easier for me to go to college and not have to pay anything, well, guess what? There's probably going to be more people who are going to go to college. I mean, think about the government providing educational loans for college and postgraduate studies. Well, guess what? We see the increase. We see this live, how it's happening. And so why couldn't it similarly happen with welfare? And so you have the same result that would occur if the disincentives to go on welfare become weaker, right? So he gives an example. If a business offers, and I'm not going to say the example because I think I did a good one with the education one because we can see that real time, exactly. Now, the argument, of course, is that people will die, right? People will starve and they won't be able to eat if we don't give them money. Well, one, we've looked at, I think, news articles, even on our site and some of the news podcasts, where people go hungry today, right? But they're not dying. And prior to the 1930s, when there was little or no government welfare, drastically lower, if any, and yet there was no mass starvation in the streets. There weren't newspaper headlines and articles written that, 20 people died on the street today because they didn't have food to eat, right? So why do we need this stuff? Or that 50 people died from heat exhaustion because they didn't have a house. Like, we didn't hear about that stuff. It might not have been the greatest conditions, of course, but God knows it's not the greatest conditions today either. So that's it. That's that chapter. So we're done today, and I thank you for listening. And so there's 5 general themes of today's episode. And that's one, the problems we face today are not new. And it's one of the reasons I'm a pessimist, I guess, about the libertarian movement, is because nothing's changed, okay? He writes exactly, and we said this in the beginning, every issue that the problem that they had then, we face today. We probably even have more today, okay? And another theme is that slavery continues. You think about involuntary servitude, when you're forced to do something that you don't voluntarily do. And whether it be compulsory schools or having to take licensures, licensing schemes, which is something he didn't talk about. If you're being forced, for me being a lawyer, I have to take a bar exam. I have to pass it. And it's through government coercion that compels that. I can't just be a lawyer. And it's not a private thing. It's a government thing. And so is that slavery? And these are the kind of questions that we ask. And unfortunately, slavery does continue. It might not be as directly harmful in the sense of getting whipped, I suppose, but there's definitely slavery. Then the other theme is that, well, these are kind of broad ideas, is that if we prohibit an item, so if government does pick an item arbitrarily, because that's what it does, and they prohibit it, well, why not prohibit every item? Like, where is the principle? I mean, that's one of the problems, is where's that principle that if I can prohibit drugs, why can't I prohibit anything else? If I can prohibit gambling, prostitution, if I can prohibit prostitution, because it's a service by consensual adults, why can I not prohibit, getting a massage or getting your nails done, getting your hair done, your hair did? I mean, if you get your hair did and you're getting it in certain curls, well, I want to prohibit it because it causes, because you're touching someone else and that's like cheating. I don't know. I mean, these reasons they come up with don't really make sense anyways. Or it's like, yeah, whatever. Then the other question is, well, another theme is if a private entity did it, would we be okay with it? So what these themes are is basically, they're kind of like things that are fundamentally true and a fundamentally way to look at issues if you're trying to debate someone or think critically about something is that, and we did this, I think, on the Critical Thinking is Required Facebook page where we did the Ferguson thing, and there was like another shooting, a separate shooting, and some kid got shot. And there's a video on the page, and it's like the cops shot the guy, and I asked the question. I said, if in that video the way the cop shot the guy, if it had been just a private individual and he had shot him, would you think society, quotes, would be okay with that? Hell no. Hell to the nah. They would not be okay with it. They'd be condemning the shit out of the guy, and they'd be asking for death. It'd be like Zimmerman all over again times 10. And we should similarly treat everyone the same. But that's not, government's not about equality, as we've learned. And then the final theme is to protect property rights. So you can talk all about prohibition and all this other stuff, blah, 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 rights to all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Just protect property rights. It's that simple. You have the right to yourself. You have the right to the things you homesteaded. You have the right to voluntarily exchange those things that you've homesteaded. Bam. It's that simple. You've solved all the problems. Now, of course, I think there are a few really minor issues, but nothing compared to the problems that we have today that we have created by not protecting property rights. But that's today's episode. Thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. I know it was a very long episode. I apologize, but I think it's very educational. I think you learned something. Make sure you check out criticalthinkingisrequired.com. And thank you for listening. And as always, think critically.